Okay, recording. Here's my PowerPoint. This is all preliminary. Sorry about this. It'll take a minute to get this set up. Then we'll start talking about Korea and Japan. Well, this is for you who are going on the trip, the FPRI trip to Japan. And I've been asked to do a little bit of background on Japan and Korea. And I've titled this Korea and Japan, an Unhappy History, relationship of ups and downs, mostly downs. So it's not a happy story. It's not a happy story about Japan and Korea, as we shall see as we go along here. Bottom line, though, it's not that bad at the end. Okay, so here we go. And I've got my email address there. If you have any questions about anything I've said here and want to email me, that'd be fine. I hope this doesn't come across too negative about Japan. Japan's a wonderful place. I love visiting Japan. I have great colleagues and friends here on my campus and other places from Japan. But we're talking about a historical thing that's not very happy. The contemporary situation is a lot better. So let's launch, and let's see if this thing will work. Here we go. Okay, well, we're going to talk about contemporary relations, but to get to the contemporary, we have to talk about the historical. So let's start off on history. Here's a map, a setting looking at Korea and Japan and China. But notice the title of this map. It says China and Japan. Hey, where's Korea? Typical that Korea often gets left out. The second and third largest economies in the world are right there, and Korea is only the 12th largest economy in the world, so it doesn't count. If you were to pick up Korea, cut it out of this map here with your scissors and pick it up and drop it over in Asia, in Europe, it'd be a major European country. But here in Asia, it's surrounded by two giants and is left out as indicated on this map. This is the way a lot of textbooks are, a chapter on China and a chapter on Korea, or maybe a chapter on China, a chapter on Japan and Korea. I said Korea just then. I meant China and one on Japan. And Korea is often left out. One thing about Korea and Japan, going back to the earliest connections, they're both considered members of the same Altaic language family. They're not Chinese language families. Linguistically, they're both very, very different from Chinese, although both use Chinese characters. And so it gives the impression that it's somehow connected to China linguistically. And linguistically, it's not. The Chinese characters are a late borrowing that comes in historically. But in earliest times, prehistoric times, Korean and Japanese were part of the same Altaic language family, together with these other families indicated in green on this map. Now, having said that, linguists are not entirely happy with that conclusion. And the same Altaic language family has some pretty weak connections, such that some linguists are saying that Japanese is a language isolate. And some are saying even that Korean is a language isolate, which means it's not related to other languages and other language trees and that sort of thing. Well, I'll leave that controversy to the linguists and just say, for now, they're both considered part of the same Altaic language family. And there are certain similarities that make you think, indeed, that they are similar, even though linguists are arguing about that. The earliest history, we see actually these three kingdoms. We talk about the Three Kingdoms period. How many kingdoms were there in the Three Kingdoms period? Well, there were four. For most of the Three Kingdoms period, there were four. But Kaya, the latest one, the youngest one, got gobbled up earlier, 100 years before the other two. So we often ignore poor Kaya. But Kaya, interestingly enough, had some of the strongest connections with Japan. In fact, all four of the three kingdoms had connections with Japan, and there are records about each kingdom, Koguryo, sending emissaries, and Japanese visiting Koguryo, and Shilla as well. But Kaya is the one that's strongest, and second strongest is probably Paekje. There were strong connections between Paekje and Japan in the earliest history. But even this earliest history is not without its controversies. One of the controversies is it has to do with what's called the horse rider theory. And this is that horse riders from up in Manchuria came riding down into Korea and set up the Baekje kingdom. In fact, Baekje means 100 crossings of rivers, and it implies migration from farther up north. And indeed, historically, we have some evidence of the Puyo people getting beat up in wars between the Xiongnu and the Xianbi and the Chinese and the Goguryeo, and they escaped down into Korea. And it may be the same with the Shilla kingdom. There's some evidence of horses in mythology there. Well, the theory goes on that these horse riders, conquerors who conquered sedentary, less sophisticated people, actually went on through the Korean peninsula all the way into Japan. And this theory, if you play it out, argues that the Yamato clan, which is still the ruling family in Korea, or excuse me, in Japan, may have originally come from Korea. The Japanese historians mainly don't like that. There's some that go along with this idea, but it's an interesting idea that's out there, and certainly a lot of Koreans like the idea. They like the idea that the Yamato ruling clan of Japan is really originally a Korean family. Having said that, as soon as I say that, I know some Japanese folks will say, oh, maybe not, and so it's controversial. Let me just leave it at that. Archaeologically, there's very, very strong evidence linking Korea and Japan, especially linking Kaya, tombs and excavated artifacts there with Kyushu, the southernmost Japanese islands. You look at this period of archaeology with these kinds of armor and things, and you cannot tell the difference between those made in Japan and those made in Korea. They're so similar in their technology and their form and shape and all this. So there are very clearly some significant contacts and connections between early Japan and early Korea. The earliest historical records, we just looked briefly at archaeology, but what do the historical records say? Well, the earliest Japanese records are the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. And these two early Japanese histories do mention Korea, the three kingdoms, the different kingdoms and such. And similarly, the earliest Korean histories, Samguk Sagi and the Samguk Yusa, also talk about Japan just a little bit and the connections with Japan. And also one of the earliest histories is the Kwangeto Stele, a huge stone monument commemorating the conquests of one of the Goguryeo kings. And it there talks about Japan. And interesting that this stele, in modern times, it's a 414 document, the year 414 CE. This document, this stone monument, was rediscovered in the Japanese period, I think in the 1920s. It had fallen over and was covered with sand and a sandbar on the side of a river. Well, they pulled it up, and it now stands where it originally was on the north side of the Yalu. It's really in China, not on Korean territory. But Goguryeo Kingdom went up into China at that point, and to what is today China, and to what some people call Manchuria. And this monument has some references to Japan, and there's one segment where it's the letters have been obliterated a little bit, so they've gone through and scratched it out. And some people suspect the Japanese historians who weren't happy with what it said marred it to destroy that record. And apparently the theory is that talks about Japanese court coming and paying tribute to the Goguryeo court. Well, there's a lot of controversy about the earliest written histories. We'll talk about this just a little bit more in a minute. From the Korean point of view, the Korean migrants moved from the continent into the peninsula and onto the islands. That the wave of sophisticated culture came from the continent to the peninsula, to the islands. And indeed, there's evidence for this. It's clear that Baekje monks were instrumental in founding Buddhist temples and in creating Buddhist images. Here's an indication of one of these. The one on the left is Japanese, the one on the right is Korean. In fact, the one on the left, I think, is Japanese treasure number 1, as they've listed all their treasures in numerical order. These two Buddhist images of this Maitreya, this meditative Maitreya, clearly are similar, and the historical record says that the Japanese one on the left, was done by a Baekje monk who visited Japan and who is credited with building this temple. This is the oldest Buddhist temple in Japan. It's in Nara, just outside of Kyoto, and it clearly has a Paekje monk as its founder. So this kind of connection is clear. There is a point of view from some Japanese who say that the Japanese culture radiated backward toward the Korean peninsula. See, the dominant argument is that culture came out of China, certainly Buddhism came out of China into Korea and on to Japan. But there are those that argue that there was Japanese culture that radiated backward onto the Korean peninsula. Option number 3 is to say neither of the above or both of the above, and say that really what's going on is a thalassocracy. How's that for a Scrabble word? Get that in your Scrabble game. Thalassocracy, do you know what that is? It's the idea that a entity, probably pre-statecraft, but a tribal confederation kind of early statecraft kind of entity existed on the seas and had ports on both sides of the sea. And it was a seafaring culture, and the culture went back and forth between the two. This is a pretty satisfying argument, because it implies that you can have a backwash of culture. The culture can go one way, but then it can go back the other way. And this might be a better explanation for how these early Japanese tribal entities were associated with Korea. Certainly with Kaya, maybe even with Paekje. But in all of this, one thing that sticks in the craw of Koreans, if we can say it that way, is that this argument that the Japanese once held colonies in Korea, in early historic or prehistoric times, that once there were colonies, this idea was utilized in the early 20th century when Japan recolonized, if that's their point of view, when they made a colony of Korea in the modern era. And there's historic precedent for it, because we owned it once and we can own it again, you see. And so this idea is really offensive to Koreans, because this idea was used to exploit Koreans in the 20th century. And part of this issue is the Japanese word for the Kaya kingdom. I mentioned Kaya. We had it on the map there a minute ago. It's the one down in the bottom, the little triangle with Shilla on one side and Paekje on the other side, the little one down in the middle. The Japanese word for Kaya is Mimana. But Mimana, boys and girls, is like Voldemort. It's the word that's never to be spoken. It's the old word in Japanese texts that was used to rationalize the Japanese takeover of Korea in 1910. And this word should not be used to describe the Korean kingdom of Kaya. Unfortunately, there was a world history textbook just in the last couple of years that resurrected this term and said Japan once had a kingdom in Korea called Mimana. This is highly controversial and more so even offensive to Korean listeners. Okay, so from that earliest time, with some controversy about the establishment of kingdoms in Korea and the establishment of the Yamato state in Japan, things went fairly swimmingly for the next 1,000 years or so. And here I said period of mutual respect. Maybe that's not quite right. Maybe one side would look down his nose a little at the other side, because ethnocentrism is a common feature. People like to look down at the other. But still, they got along, and there was trade and such until 1592, when things all fall apart. In the middle of these good days, this 1,000-year period of things getting along okay, there were minor skirmishes. There were pirates on both sides that would raid the coast and this sort of thing. But interesting, in the middle of this, there's the account of the Buddhist monk Ennen from Japan, the Japanese monk Ennen, who travels to China. And he talks of Korea and Korean settlements in China. And he talks about superior Korean ships. His Japanese ships took on water going over to China, and they stopped in Korea to get the ships repaired. And when they came back, they sold their ships when they got to China. When they came back, they bought new ships, and Ennen insisted on buying Korean ships because he wanted to get back without any leaking and any peril. So aside from the Annan account, maybe that's a good illustration of how things went fairly well between the Japanese and the Koreans during this 1,000-year period. But things go south in 1592, and they go south in a big way. This invasion of Korea by a huge Japanese army is certainly the single most important factor in Korean-Japanese relations in pre-modern times, and maybe for all time. Hideyoshi was the shogun, the warlord who reunified the Japanese islands after the fall of the, I want to say it was the Kamakura period. They had a period of warfare and things all fall apart. All the daimyo and all of the different regions of Japan fight. And Hideyoshi is the tough guy that wins it all and reunifies the country of Japan. Well, he looks for greater worlds to conquer. He's got this huge army now, and they've been victorious. They've conquered all of Japan. Well, there are greater worlds to conquer. He knows about China. So he sends a message to the Korean king and said, would you lend us an imperial road to go to China? Well, this was just offensive, just all up and down the line, that Japan would ask for a road, let our troops just march through your land. That's not going to happen. And an imperial road for the emperor of Japan, well, there's no emperor of Japan, the only emperor in the world is China from the Korean point of view. And this was just offensive up and down the road. And the Koreans didn't know quite what to think of it. They thought it was, totally preposterous and unbelievable at the outset. And they sent an embassy over to see what was going on in Japan. The ambassador came back and said, no, there's no problem. The Japanese aren't going to do this. But the deputy ambassador got off the beaten track and looked around and saw this huge armament and soldiers and such and said, no, this is really a serious matter. And certainly the Japanese did invade. In May of 1592, the invasion was very, very successful at the outset. They marched from Busan, where they landed, up to Seoul in about 3 weeks' time. But marching up toward the Chinese border, the Chinese entered the war, and they sent naval forces as well as the land forces. And the invasion soon bogs down after about a year's time. And following a period of negotiations, not with Korea. Korea's left out, remember? It's Korea, the map of China, and Japan. Korea's left out. Well, that's what happened here too. China and Japan do all the negotiating. Negotiations fall apart, and war breaks out again in 1597. But the following spring, Hideyoshi dies. And on his deathbed, he calls for the troops to come home, and the invasion's over. Really 2 one-year periods of war, but in the Japanese records, it's often called the 7-Year War. In Korean records, it's called the Imjin War, Imjin being the Chinese cyclical date, the Chinese date for 1592. This painting is of the Japanese ships, this huge armada. Look at all these ships down here, landing and coming ashore and assaulting the Korean fortresses. And this second painting, these 2 paintings were done 200 years later, but they were based faithfully on written accounts of different episodes within the war. If you, this second painting is of the inland fortress of Dongnae, the regional capital for the Busan area. And here is the assault on the Dongnae fortress. And I've got a couple of blow-ups here. One of them is of this region right here, where we'll look at these rooftops for just a second. The other one is this region up here. And the first one, this is close up. It's fuzzy. I'm sorry for the poor detail. But these are 2 women, 3 women. There's 1, 2, 3 women, 2 on this roof line and 1 on this line, who, according to the account, they did all they could to fight the Japanese before they were killed, including crawling up on the roof and throwing roof tiles as armament down on the Japanese below. Well, you can imagine it wasn't very effective, but that's what you see here. You see the brown spaces here is the roof made bare down to its clay substructure as they were throwing these roof tiles down on the assaulting Japanese. Women with roof tiles against Japanese with guns is not a very balanced warfare here. And then at the top, there was an account of a messenger who, rather than stay and fight, we needed somebody to volunteer to take the word out, to spread the word, so the Japanese won't catch the next unit, the next unit, the next unit off guard. So he sent off as a messenger to warn other fortresses, other cities on the way to Seoul, and to warn the king. So this is a depiction of that, with Japanese soldiers running after this fellow making his escape on his horse. Well, again, these two paintings were done 200 years after the fact, but based on historical accounts, it captured the imagination of some painter, and he thought, we ought to paint this up. And so we have these interesting paintings of the assault on May 25th, 1592. Okay, so what was the effect of the war? Loss of life for Koreans was somewhere between 2 million and 4 million people. We don't know for sure. We don't know what the total population was, but it was around 12 to 14 million at the time. So roughly a fourth of the population was killed, maybe even a little higher than that. If there 12 million or 4 million died, that's a third of the population. Destruction of homes, buildings, ruination of farmlands. Anything that could be burned was burned. You can find very, very few buildings and very, very few documents that predate the war. Historians like to talk about a pre-Imjin document. If you can find a pre-Imjin document, you've got yourself a rare bird. And there were official histories called the Shillok, the Chinese call it Shirlu. Korea made 4 copies of the Shillok and stored them in 4 different places to protect against destruction during times of chaos. And 3 of the 4 copies were destroyed. But fortunately, one that was kept in a box canyon that faced south. Well, the box canyon was facing north, and the Japanese were coming from the south and missed it. They didn't destroy that one copy. So fortunately, we have the precious first 200 years of the Chosun Dynasty record recorded or preserved. Now, the Japanese did steal all kinds of things. There are all sorts of Buddhist imagery, Buddhist paintings, these sorts of things. Innumerable treasures were stolen, and mostly unreturned. I was in Gyeongju a month ago, and at the National Museum in Gyeongju, they had a special exhibit in their rotating exhibit hall. They've got 3 halls of a regular exhibit, and then they have a rotating exhibit. They have treasures from Japan, Korean treasures in Japan. And they were borrowed from the Japanese owners and brought back to Korea for display. So the fact that the Japanese have these things and own them is not a surprise. Okay, we know it's there. And they also, in addition to stealing treasures, they stole, kidnapped artisans. There are 5 or 6 villages in Japan that are inhabited by descendants of potters who were kidnapped and taken to Japan to make pottery. The Japanese liked the Korean pottery, and rather than just steal all the pottery, they stole the potters, and so they could make their own. And it's been a tradition in Japan that these potters are highly prestigious artisans, and their art and craft are still preserved to these days, and there are certain villages that have these. So the effect of the war has lasted till the current time. Excuse me. On the Korean side, what's the heritage of the war? Well, a lot of distrust of the Japanese, a lot of hatred for the Japanese, for one thing, a lot of resentment that lingers about this unprovoked. What did the Koreans do? They didn't do anything to deserve this, and yet this happened to them. It's a history of martyrs. One of the more famous martyrs is the wife of Yulgok Senseng. Yulgok Senseng is the man on the 5001 note. He was this great Confucian scholar that offered so much to the building of society in Korea. And he died 8 years before the war started, but his widow survived. And the record shows that she died at his graveside. She went up to his tomb, and it's unclear how she died, whether she had committed suicide to forestall slaughter by the Japanese, or whether the Japanese actually killed her on the graveside of her husband. But there's that story of martyrs. And then there's the story of heroes, the most dominant of which is Lee Sun-shin, the great admiral who was the victor at sea. The Korean land forces were greatly overwhelmed, and there's nothing good to say about the land forces to speak of. There's some generals, and there's some stories of valiant defenses and such, but The only real success that Korea had was at sea. And the leader of the success was Lee Sun-shin. They made a movie of it fairly recently, one of the battles where he was completely overwhelmed and yet persevered, and his ships prevailed. His 13 ships prevailed against something like 300 Japanese ships. And these accounts are not exaggerated. We know they're not exaggerated because the Japanese accounts coincide with the Korean accounts. The Japanese histories talk about, oh, we lost another 12 ships, we lost another 5 ships in this battle with the cursed Korean Admiral Lee Sun-shin. So they knew about him, they wrote about him, he shows up in their history. So we know it's not just a one-sided, exaggerated account from the Korean side. Lee Sun-shin is a hero on the money, and here you can see over his shoulder the turtle boats. These are the world's first ironclad warships. They had iron plates on the top to keep enemies fire arrows and to keep enemies from boarding. Warfare in those days was not just sink the enemy ship, but board the enemy ship, kill the sailors, and take over the ship. Well, with the turtle ship, that made it more difficult for the enemy. This 501 note is no longer used. They've gone to a 501 coin. It's about a 50-cent piece at this point. But here he is on older coinage or older currency. And he's on the top of a huge statue in downtown Seoul. Right at the base of the statue, you can barely see a little model of a turtle boat. And in the back, there's King Sejong, and here's the old palace. And then back in the far side is the Blue House, the presidential palace for the president of Korea today. Here's another picture showing the scale of it a little bit better with people down below on the turtle boat here. And there's Lee Sun-shin with his big sword carefully looking over the main intersection, the focal intersection in downtown Seoul. Well, after the war, there was a period of peace for about 300 years. And then the Japanese come again. Now, the fact that it was 300 years is significant. It was a long time. That's as long as most dynasties last. Korean dynasties tend to last 500 years rather than 200 or 300 like most country dynasties. But for the 300 years, there was not a major problem with Japan until 1876. And then this time the Japanese come back again, but not a wholesale invasion like before, but rather slightly diplomatic, because what the Japanese did was eventually enforce this unilateral treaty on Korea in 1876. And it was what had been done to them, to the Japanese, by Commodore Perry in 1854. So just 22 years, the Japanese had modernized and built an overwhelming navy such they could overwhelm Korea and force a treaty on Korea that opened Korea from its isolated hermit kingdom state to a state that had to have interactions with other states like Japan. And then the Americans come in 1882, and other countries come in, and Korea starts to develop in the modern world. Well, what had happened to Japan then, this landing of Commodore Perry is depicted on this, I think it's a woodblock print. It might be a painting, I'm not sure. It looks like a watercolor, doesn't it? But here are the black ships. We talk about Commodore Perry's black ships off in the distance. This is a Commodore Perry ship. It's both masted, so you could take advantage of the wind, but it also had steam, so you could move if you didn't have favorable winds as well. This is a painting from a Japanese source about the landing on Konghwa Island. It was called the Unyo incident. The Unyo was a unarmed navigation ship that sailed really close to the Konghwa Island fortresses on purpose to attract shore fire. The Japanese knew that the Koreans had had shore battles with the French and the Americans in 71. And so, sure enough, the Koreans fired on this unarmed surveying ship, and then the warships were just over the horizon, and they sailed in and said, "You can't be firing on our ships," and used this as the pretext to force a treaty on Korea. It's called the Treaty of Konghwa, meaning this island here. This island is just off from Seoul down the Han River, and the Han River and Imjin River estuary It's a focal point between North Korea and South Korea. There's the dividing line right there between them. And the Treaty of Konghwa then was the entry point to Seoul and the entry point for Japan to get into Korean affairs from 1876 onward. The king in Korea at this time was a rather hapless fellow by the name of Kojong. Nobody says much good about Kojong for Seoul. And then his son, who's described as not fully adequate, took over the kingdom under pressure from the Japanese. The Japanese deposed King Kojong when he tried to send an emissary to the Hague Conference saying that Korea did not want to be part of the Japanese Empire. So he was deposed, and this hapless son was put on the throne in his place. So King Kojong was the king at the time, but other factors around had an interesting connection with Japan, since today we're talking about Japan. There was a group called the Enlightenment Party. These were the progressives, and they had sent students off to Japan to study this new modern world, this westernized, industrialized world that they were hearing about. And they came back with lots of ideas on how to help Korea to modernize with a modern army and a postal service and other ideas. The Independent Party, well, the Enlightenment Party, later there's an Independent Party. These are Koreans who try to preserve Korea's independence and seek contact with other nations, not the dominant Japan. So we have problems, though. In 1882, there's a mutiny. There's a Japanese painting showing the withdrawal of the Japanese general who was in town at that point. The issue was the Japanese were helping to modernize the Korean army, but they couldn't modernize all the Korean army. They modernized one elite unit, gave them nice new uniforms and nice new weaponry, while other units were jealous. And there was this retaliation from the jealous units against the elite unit and against the Japanese, and the Japanese general here retreats. This mutiny led to a treaty that the Japanese used as a lever against the Chinese, because Korea was loyal to and part of the Chinese tributary system. And in this treaty here, from the 1882 mutiny, Japan insisted that China sign an agreement not to send more troops in to Korea unless notifying Japan, and that Japan would send equal numbers of troops to keep the forces balanced. This seemed like a very unimportant treaty at that time, but we shall see in another 12 years later, this flares up to damage Korea one more time. And that's in this Tonghak Rebellion. The Tonghak rebels were originally a Tonghak religion, and for 30 years they minded their own business as a religion, and yet there were forces within the Tonghak movement that wanted to use Tonghak as a political lever. And the leadership refused and refused and refused, and finally acceded. And in 1894, they turned the Tonghak religious group loose as rebels, and they started taking over huge territories, huge pieces of territory, virtually the whole southwest side of Korea. And I think there are more over in the southeast that aren't shown on this map. But what they would do is the rebels would go in and take over a magistrate's office. That's what all these little dots are, the various county magistrates. And it turns out that Korea had a welfare system of preserving grain over the winter for people that had hard luck and bad luck. Maybe the rust and the mold would get in and ruin their seed supply, and they were in hard times in the spring. Well, they had these granaries that were actually set up at the initiative of Yorgok, the man on the 5001 note, the man whose wife was martyred that I mentioned earlier. He's the one that said we need this welfare system. Well, welfare systems are wonderful things, but they're, in this case, it was exploited and used by the magistrate to enrich himself. He would collect extra grain, an extra tax of grain that he would keep in his nice granary at the magistrate's office. And rather than helping people that were hard-pressed over the winter, he would sell it off when people were desperate for food. And rather than a welfare thing, it became a symbol of corruption for the magistrate. Well, that's where the Tongak rebels struck first. And they break into all these granaries in all these different counties and hand out the food to all the people. And it was a very popular uprising. And the government was stuck. The thing just spread like wildfire, and they sent in their troops, and they could not put it down. So they sent for help from Big Brother. They see China as their big brother in this relationship, and said, "China, we need help." And China said, "Okay, we'll send you some soldiers." And the Japanese said, cried foul. You know, you've violated our treaty from 1882. We're balancing forces. So the Japanese sent in forces, and this led to the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, starting with the Tonghak uprising that was aimed at this corruption of the system, and it quickly spread among peasants who felt that the domestic exploitation and foreign powers were interfering in Korean affairs, and so people were upset. They followed this Tonghak movement into war, and this triggered the rebellion triggered the war between China and Japan, which was settled at the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which isn't on this map, but it's on Japan, southern border town of port town of Japan, and this gave Japan complete leverage over Korea, because China now was defeated in war and was forced to give up any interest in Korea. This war also led to what are called the Cabo reforms, a whole series of reforms that were enacted between 1894 and 1897. Cabo means 94. It's funny, we sometimes say the Cabo reforms of 1897, which is to say the 1894 reforms of 1897. But these reforms, I'll show you a little bit here in just a minute. But it also gave the Japanese the upper hand in doing whatever they thought was best in Korea, which included killing the queen, who was clearly pro-Chinese and anti-Japanese. Here's a portrait of this young woman in her royal headdress, and here she is looking up defiantly at the samurai that's about to come down on her with his sword. And they've killed every other woman in the palace, because the Japanese had tried to kill Queen Min several years before and had failed because she changed clothes with one of her servants, who took the knife, and she escaped out the back door in her serving clothes. So this time they killed all the women in that part of the palace to make sure that they got her. It's an awful story. But again, the upshot of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 was the defeat of China. And here you see the naval ships. It was fought on land and on sea. And bottom line is, the new modernized Japanese Navy with fairly small ships was able to outmaneuver the new modernized Navy of China that had these big ships, and the small ships sunk every single one of the new Chinese ships, and so left China very helpless, and Japan in domination of the seas. It also gave Japan control of Taiwan and diplomatic influence over all of Asia. Here's a political cartoon from that time where the Japanese midget has killed the Goliath. China defeated them in this war, and it's depicted here in this cartoon, showing how people didn't expect smaller Japan to defeat the bigger China. The murder of Queen Min, at the time she was Queen Min, later she was posthumously elevated to an empress status, and she's known more today as Empress Myeongsan. In fact, there's an opera about this event and about her, and it played in New York as well as played in Seoul and other places. So she was quite a heroic woman who was unjustly murdered by Japanese assassins, who very proudly posed for a picture after they had done this. So this is just a ghoulish event that these samurai took pride in. Many of them claim to be samurai or children of samurai. There's a interesting upbeat footnote to this story, and that is about 10 years ago, the grandson of one of the samurai that did the assassination, who was most proud of it and identified in this picture as one of the assassins, and a few other grandsons and great-grandsons of this group came to Korea. Here we're talking 110 years after the event. They came in 2005. And they went to the tomb of Queen Min, where her remains are buried, and bowed down and apologized for what their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had done. So amidst all this chaos and ill will, there's some great magnanimous events that took place, and that's one. The political reforms, now notice I've written it with the G on one side and the K on the other side. This is a factor of Romanization. On the Three Kingdoms, Koguryo can be with a K, can be with a G. Pekje can be with a P, can be with a B. The problem is there are four sets of consonants in Korean. KG is one, PB is one, TD is one, and CHJ. Those four sets are all represented by only four syllables. There are four letters in the alphabet, not 8 letters. So the K and the G are the same letter. It's the environment that determines whether it's pronounced like a K or pronounced like a G. At the beginning of a word, it's more like a K. So Cabo reform sounds a little more like it, but it's not a hard K, it's a softer K that turns into a G in the middle of a sentence. So I mention this to you because it's important as you read things. Don't say, well, how were the Cabo reforms different from the Gabo reforms? That they're the same thing. So don't be confused by the difference of spelling. Well, here I pulled this list off of a lesson plan from off the internet about the Cabo reform. The first objective was to fully establish Korea's independence as a nation. Well, that was allegedly what the Japanese were saying, but in reality, the Japanese were taking Korea from the protection of the Chinese so that they could be gobbled up by the Japanese, which was to happen in another 10 years and 15 years after this. They organized the modern police force and military, reforms in the education system. They abolished the old civil examination system that had been around for 1,000 years and set up a modern elementary and high school and college system that was open to everyone, not just to the elite. That's a very positive thing. On social reform, they removed the social status system. What does that mean? That's a very nice way of saying they abolished slavery. Slaves were all freed. Now, as in the American South, you say, okay, you're free. How free are you? Economically, how are you different now that you're free? You're worse off because you don't have somebody, that you're working for and taking care of. So the slavery system in Korea has taken a long time to work its way out. In fact, I've got a thesis that it was in large measure the cause of the Korean War, aside from the international aspects of it. So this marks the beginning of the adopting the Western calendar, the Japanese-style Western calendar, not the Chinese-style Western calendar. And then one of the most egregious elements was the top-knot decree. The top-knot decree was that all adult men had to cut their top knots. Now, the top knot was part of ceremonial manhood in the old days. When a man became a man, when a boy became a man, he would have his hair that was in a pigtail down his back tied on the top of his head, and then an inner cap would be put on top of that, and then the horsehair cap would be put on top of that. It indicates becoming a man. And to say that to cut the top knot is sort of the Korean response to it. What the Japanese were really saying was modern haircuts, cut your hair in modern fashion. And the Koreans took it as the top knot decree, where they couldn't keep their hair in the old form. Next on the scene is the war with Russia. Here's a political cartoon showing Russia over the horizon. And there's the Japanese and the Chinese stepping on poor Korea. Notice how it's spelled, Korea, with a P for the R in Cyrillic and a backward R for A in Cyrillic, so the Russian sympathy for how Korea is being treated here. Well, this war with Russia and Japan was supposed to end like this. Here's the strong Russian Navy punching the Japanese Navy right in the kisser. But that's not how it turned out. Here's a political cartoon saying the primary objective was not Korea so much as Manchuria. And here's this Manchurian damsel being fought over by the Russian and the Japanese caricature here. Here's a political cartoon showing England trying to stop the Japanese. They had an alliance at this point, and the Americans are not involved, but standing by looking amused at this these shenanigans. The war was fought around Korea, in the Korean waters, on Korean soil, as well as on Manchurian soil. And here's a map showing where some of these battles took place. And again, the Russians were caught off guard, were quite unprepared, and there's a literature about the Russians being very tentative and not fully committed to the war, and not thinking that the Japanese would really be a formidable opponent. And it's interesting that throughout Asia, there had been beaten up pretty badly by European powers. Southeast Asia, all these European colonies set up. China was being carved up by the British and the French and the Germans and the Americans, all had an interest in China. Here, an Asian power defeats a European power. So this was a great shot in the arm for the Asians in general, and cheering for Japan until the Japan war machine rolled into China and Southeast Asia. They quit cheering for Japan. But the defeat of the Russians was an enormous event, an earth-shaking event in world history. The settlement of the war was done at a city called Portsmouth. Where's Portsmouth? Do you know of any other Portsmouth besides Portsmouth, New Hampshire? Indeed, on the east coast of the United States, this war was settled between the Russians and the Japanese. Quite surprising that it would be so far away. And here's a portrait of the Japanese and the Russians sitting down as the Russians signed these documents. Why Portsmouth? I'm not sure why it was Portsmouth, but I know why it was in the United States. It was because Teddy Roosevelt is given credit for helping to end the war. And he received the Nobel Prize. The sixth one ever given was given to Teddy Roosevelt. I visited Portsmouth a couple of years ago and wanted to know if there was a museum or something. There's this little thing in this one building where some of the treaty talks were held. It's not a big museum, but just a little one. One thing I found out that Teddy never went to New Hampshire. He operated from Washington, D.C. I don't know why they had it up north, maybe because these northern kingdoms would be happier in the north rather than the southern sweaty Washington. At any rate, Teddy Roosevelt got the Nobel Prize for bringing them together, which was not a good thing in certain books, because the Americans are accused of being double dealers with this. And the anti-American crowd in Korea points to this as showing the lack of goodwill on the part of the Americans in brokering this deal, because Americans apparently agreed to let Japan have its will if Japan would promise not to interfere with American interests in the Philippines, which neither side kept their promise. But anyway, that's another matter. Well, as a result of the 1905 war with Russia, Japan sets up a protectorate. You know what a protectorate is? It means you handle the foreign affairs of another country. And Japan took over the foreign affairs of Korea. And this is subtle preparation for the eventual annexation. And there's no doubt about it. One of my colleagues in Korea has written a book on financial administration. And she's not that interested in finances per se, but she used that as evidence to show how the Japanese were already, right after 1905, preparing for the annexation. They were preparing for greater and greater involvement in Korea. It was not, well, we'll do the annexation forever, and I mean, we'll do the protectorate forever. We don't have any intention of annexing. No, from the very beginning, they had their designs on annexing Korea, which took place in 1910. And Korea becomes a part of the Japanese empire. We look at the Japanese colonial period. We call it the Japanese occupation or the colonial period, with three phases. The first was somewhat diplomatic. The second was the cultural administration. The third is called the assimilationist period. None of these three terms really tell you much about what's going on. So let's look at it just a little bit. And here are the dates for them. from the beginning, 1910 to 1919. And then what happens is there's the March 1st movement on March 1st, 1919, that marks the end of that. And the cultural administration was less heavy-handed and really quite an enlightened period. Korean arts and literature flourished during this period, for example. But it comes to an end. It starts to end with the Mukden incident in 1931, and then it really turns bad after the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, where Japan is on full war footing with China. Well, let's look at these three periods in a little bit more detail. The takeover of Korea was not an invasion at gunpoint thing. It was very subtle, very clever, and working with Korean collaborators who were huge in numbers. Koreans don't like me saying that, but a lot of Koreans admit it too. The Koreans didn't see this annexation coming, but their collaborators went along with it. The man that signed the document, Lee Won-young, is this great devil, one of the worst devils in Korean history, this great traitor who signed away the country as prime minister to Japan. Interesting story, one of my colleagues says that a student of his came up to him and after his Korean class and said, the reason I'm taking this Korean class is I've been living here, and I was in Canada, actually living in Canada for all my life, and I don't know much about my Korea, but I want to learn more about it because my grandfather was Lee Won-young. His grandfather was the great arch trader. Well, he got a pretty bad rap. He was probably no different from a lot of people that saw Japan as offering a better lifestyle and a modern, democratic situation to get away from the old imperial order or the royal order of the court. So no wonder so many people went along with the Japanese. It seemed better. And sometimes this first period is called the military period because there was military suppression of uprisings. But the point is, there were no uprisings until they took over. And before they took over, it looked like Japan was this great benevolent neighbor that was helping out with better health care and education, these sorts of things. But once they took over and Korea was annexed and Koreans realized they'd lost their country, people take up arms, and they were suppressed brutally. But still, the ones that went along with this were elected to offices. We had a functioning democracy under the Japanese in Korea at this point. And even in Japan, there were Korean candidates that ran for office in Japan and were elected to the Diet, the National Assembly in Japan. The first period ends with the March 1st movement, inspired by Woodrow Wilson's 14 points at the end of World War I. Huge uprising spread all over Korea, all over the world. They sent word out. They smuggled the Declaration out. It was a Declaration of Independence. Yes, Declaration of Independence, modeled after the U.S. and Thomas Jefferson and all of that. 33 signers, 1 Buddhist, 16 Christians, and 16 Chundokyo. We talked about the Tonghak Rebellion. Well, they changed their name because the religious faction didn't want to be involved with the political faction, but they were dragged into it. And to avoid politics, now they changed their name from Tonghak to Chundokyo. And now here they are involved with politics again, signing the Declaration. The cultural administration, the aftermath of the March 1st movement, was a liberal time in Korea, but it was also a liberal time in Japan. This is boomtown in the 20s, right? Until October 29 with the crash. And we Americans tend to be rather myopic. We talk about how the crash was so bad on America and New York stock market and all this stuff. But it was a worldwide phenomenon, which led, this economic depression, led to the rise of militarism in a place like Germany. Have you ever heard of Adolf Hitler? What was he offering to the Germans? Was boomtown, a resurrection of boomtown. And in Japan, too, it was the militarists who said, this is what we need to revive our economy. We need to conquer more lands to get better economic opportunities for our people. Here's a political cartoon showing the Koreans were the stepping stone or the bridge toward Manchuria from Korea, from Japan across Korea into Manchuria. The final period then begins with this Mukden incident in 1931, where a railroad car explodes in the middle of the railroad yard in Mukden, which is Shenyang, China, Manchuria, China. And the Chinese don't like to say Manchuria. It implies all the negative things of being manipulated by outside forces there in Manchuria, but we'll use the word Manchuria. But it's interesting that the excuse the Japanese military used was, there are terrorists. There are terrorists in Manchuria. We need to send in our armies to protect our citizens who are just moving in to try business and farming up in this open territory, Manchuria. Well, yeah, terrorists. So we need to send in the army. We've come to find out, just a few years ago, we got into some documents in Japan where it was clear that what we had always suspected, and that is the Japanese had blown up the railroad train on their own and then blamed the terrorists. In 1937, there's the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which gives the Japanese excuse to march into Beijing, and war with China is a full-blown war at this point. We in America like to say, when did World War II begin? Do not say December 7th, 1941 with Pearl Harbor, because it began long before that. It's just that the Americans didn't get involved until this time. So Japan and Korea, Korea by default, Korea is pulled in on this thing because they've been dragged into the war by Japan, are on full war footing. And that gives the meaning to the assimilationist period, because after 1937, absolute loyalty to the emperor was required, and absolute loyalty meant that Korean souls with Korean names had the privilege of upgrading to Japanese names. In other words, everyone was forced to have a Japanese name, and Korean language was taught as a foreign language in Korean schools. All instruction now is all in Japanese, and Korean history was taught as Manchu Koryo history, as an attempt to negate Korean history as an entity. And this lasted until August 15th, 1945, with the defeat of the Japanese and the dropping of the atomic bombs. And in Korea, it led to liberation, but that immediately was chaotic, led to division and political strife. And eventually, within 3 years to the day, the Republic of Korea and South Korea is established. And then 3 weeks later, the North Koreans that were already better established as a state, the communist helpers from Russia had helped them set up very well. And but they waited till South Korea declared their state, so that when North Korea declared their state, they said, well, it's really all one state in Korea, but the South Koreans did it first. They did it first, as like this childish thing. They did it first, and they're the ones that are really dividing the country, and we're trying to keep it all as one, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this bad will between the two leads to war within 2 years. The Koreans don't say the Korean War. They don't talk about the Korean War. Hanguk Janjang, you don't say that. They say Yu-Gi-Oh, the 6-month 2-5 day, the 25th of June event, in the same way that we say 9/11. If something is so devastating that day forever and ever will be marred on the calendar for what happened, that's June 25th in Korea. That's the Korean War. For Korea, it was devastating. Death, despair, all over the place. But for for Japan, according to Yoshida Shigeru, who was the prime minister and a former war criminal, if things had been different, if Japan had been treated as harshly as the Germans were, Yoshida Shigeru probably would have been executed. But MacArthur wanted to keep a bunch of these administrators alive. He saw them as the hope for the future in Japan. And indeed, Yoshida Shigeru was one of these former war criminals, but he survives now as prime minister, and he referred to the Korean War as a gift from the gods. The Korean War was just what the gods provided for Japan. Why did he say such a thing? Because in the post-war economy in Japan, there was a lot of aid from the Americans at the beginning. Capitalism was thriving and everything was going well at the outset from 45 on, but by 1950, the economy starts to sag. There's a rise of communism, there are labor problems, and the economic boom, the economy was really in trouble. But now the economy starts to boom in Japan because of the Korean War. And the Americans were buying up goods and using Japan as a staging area, and this was just what the Japanese economy needed. And lest we get too critical about Japan in this regard, the Vietnam War no Korean ever said it, but it was a gift from the gods for Korea, because that was boomtown for them. They helped kickstart their economy and their boom in the late 70s and through the 80s and such. So this then leaves bad feelings on Korea's part for the Japanese, because the Japanese looked like war profiteers over the Korean War situation. Well, the Korean War was destructive for the whole Korean peninsula, leaves the Korean peninsula divided. But in regard to Japan, from the end of World War II until 1965, they have no diplomatic relations. Korea's not about to forgive Japan. But in 1965, under Park Chung-hee, who wants to see an economic development first and foremost, he goes to Japan, establishes diplomatic relations as a way to get out of the post-war destitution and this terrible poverty, hopelessness that the Koreans were stuck in after 1953. So in 1961, Park Chung-hee takes over. In 1965, we recognize Japan. Japan recognizes Korea. Before that, for 20 years, all diplomatic relations between Korea and Japan went through the American embassy. Well, now they can have direct contact, which leads to trade and loans and things that Park Chung-hee needs to get the economy booming. And that's what Park Chung-hee's economy, or what Park Chung-hee's administration was all about, was economy. And they start trading more with Japan. They get loans from the Japanese. And they copied the Zaibatsu format. You know Zaibatsu? These great conglomerates, family-owned conglomerates. Well, Koreans have Chebo, which is the same Chinese characters pronounced in a Korean way, not a Japanese way. And yet still saying the same words. Koreans like to deny that they're using a Japanese role model, but that's exactly what they were doing. And Park Chung-hee was, I've got another word for you here, was Sakura. Sakura, any Japanese speakers in the crowd, Sakura means cherry blossom. And it's a way to refer to a collaborator. If you call a Korean Sakura, it's not a compliment. Hey, cherry blossom. And Park Chung-hee was considered a Sakura because he was going to Japan and diplomatic relations established and all this stuff. There were huge demonstrations in front of the Japanese embassy and anti-Park demonstrations because of this. Because Park was considered very sympathetic to Japan and pro-Japanese. He got his military commission. He got his start in life. He was a two-star general when he took over the Korean government. Well, generals start out as a lieutenant. How to get to be a lieutenant in the Manchurian OCS in 1942. So he was a Japanese officer by the name of Takaki Masao. He changed his name in 1944 to Okamoto Minoru, who was used in suppressing Korean rebel elements in Manchuria. That was his role. So he has this questionable background, but when he comes into power in Korea in 1961, it's the economy. First and foremost, democracy can wait. And our colleague at Harvard has written up a book that is not yet out. We've got the cover for it. It's going to be out in October this year. Park Chung-hee in Modern Korea, The Roots of Militarism by Carter Eckert. He's been working on this for 20 years. So this will tell the story of Takaki Masao, in other words, better known as Park Chung-hee. Park Chung-hee is assassinated in 1979, is replaced by another general who copied Park Chung-hee, but he had more trouble. His takeover of the government, his military takeover, was met by resistance in Gwangju, and he went in with force and killed a bunch of people, around 200 people or so, and arrested a whole bunch more and all of this, took over by force, and was not a popular guy by any means. But he too turns to Japan for aid and loans for a second economic takeoff in his time. Well, what's going on in North Korea all this time? Here in South Korea, we've seen establishing relations with Japan. In North Korea, after the war, the relationship with Japan were hostile. No doubt about that. The North Koreans talk about the Japanese period, and they're very anti-Japanese, anti-American. But still, within Japan, there were stronger North Korean groups than there were South Korean groups. And the Koreans in Japan number about 2 million people. They didn't all go home after the war. People had been carted off to Japan to work in the mines and the factories and such. Many of them didn't see that they had a home to go home to in Korea and stayed on in Japan. Now the Koreans in Japan tend to be more south-leaning, They were definitely more north-leaning for a long time. But the North Korea and Japan have really been alienated of late because of an admission by Kim Jong-il, the son, the father of the current Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-il admitted that what people had been suspecting for a long time, that is that North Korea had actually kidnapped Japanese citizens from off the beach in Japan and hauled them back to North Korea to be forced language teachers to teach Japanese in North Korea. And Kim Jong-il admitted this, but refused to apologize for it. And the Japanese are still demanding an apology. And Japan and North Korea have very, very bad relations now because of this this incident. On the social front in Japan, Koreans living in Japan, there are about 2 million Koreans there. Some of them have been there now for 4 or 5, maybe we're getting into the 6th generation now. Some hide their Korean identity, some openly say they're Korean, but there are a great number who pass as Japanese. They use Japanese names, and for all intents and purposes can't be seen as or cannot be detected as being Korean in heritage. And every now and again we hear sad stories of a child who commits suicide because he grows up with anti-Korean prejudices and bullying, and the Korean kids are sometimes picked on in Japan. And here this kid has been doing the picking on, and then one day the teacher or one of his classmates says, "Well, you're Korean." And he says, "No, I'm not Korean." "Yeah, you're Korean. Your name's Ando. That's Ando and Kim. You're from the Kim clan in Korea." There's certain names that are giveaways as Japanese sounding, but are really Korean. And whatever, the poor child goes home and says, "The kids tease me in school saying I'm Korean." And the mom and dad say, "Well, we've been meaning to tell you. Yeah, you are Korean." And the kid goes and jumps off the top of the apartment building or whatnot. So we have these kinds of sad stories of unhappy prejudices and such within Japan regarding the Korean. The Koreans are often looked down upon as the lower class. They own bars and own pachinko parlors, and pachinko's this pinball machine kind of thing that they have for gambling and such. And so Koreans are often looked down upon as the dregs of society and such. Well, things are not so good in that regard. And for one final item, I almost forgot to include this, but you got to include this, the comfort woman issue. This statue, this little girl in bronze, is symbolic of the young women that were hauled off to serve in brothels for the Japanese army. The older woman here next to the woman at the statue is one of the actual victims who has survived. And notice this this statue here. Notice the background. Notice the background of these two are quite different. This statue has been replicated all over the place. There's one in Toronto. There's one in New Jersey. There's one in somewhere in Southern California. There's one in Anyang, Korea, south of Seoul. But the first one sits right opposite the Japanese embassy, right in their face, and demanding apology. And they dress it up with cold weather gear in the winter, and they have demonstrations every Wednesday at noon. If you're in Seoul and haven't got anything to do, Wednesday at noon, stop by the Japanese embassy and watch the demonstration. It goes on regularly, and they drag out these 80-year-old women who are actual survivors. Different ones come at different times. Sometimes there's one, sometimes there's 5 or 6. There are, what did I see recently? 80 survivors. Some are active, some are not. Some don't want to be identified, except to small groups. They don't get out in public and such. So it's really a problem to this day. Recently, they made a movie about it. This movie is called Going Home, for girls that can't go home. And here are 2 little girls who are living a happy life until they're abducted by the Japanese army. A friend of mine in Korea, an older woman, said that she was sent off to her uncle's house in Manchuria, who was a colonel in the Japanese army, because he could keep her safe, keep her from being abducted, because they feared that she might get abducted in the street. They said that a Japanese squad might be assigned to go out and pick up 5 new girls for the assignment for this month. And they just go out and kidnap people. And it was just horrendous. Anyway, there's a movie about this here. I haven't seen it yet. I don't know if I want to see it. I think it's going to be so gruesome, but I suppose I got to at some point. Well, the comfort woman issue has finally been settled once and for all in December this last year, 70-year anniversary after the settling of the Korean War. And the Japanese government recognized what they had done, stated so. They'd refused to state so up to this point. They refused to state that there was an official policy of the Japanese army, and apologized and offered compensation, and the Korean government agreed. So it's all settled and done, right? Wrong. It's not settled. It's far from settled, because the survivors in the survivor group have rejected this final settlement because they were not consulted. They were not brought into the discussions. It was dumped on their heads like everything else by this abusive, high-handed unilateral government. Now it's South Korea that's as bad as Japan, you see. And so this is it's not a happy ending, although it might be the ending to the story. Well, officially it's ended, unofficially it may never end. Well, that's a pretty grim story, but there's hope on the horizon. The Korean wave, this culture wave of movies, soap operas, going out from Korea, K-pop musical groups have been huge. This Winter Sonata is the name of a soap opera, serialized story about a nice Korean man and how well he treats his wife and this sort of thing. And it was a big hit in Japan. In fact, the New York Times wrote about 3 marriage brokerage houses that sprung up to help line up Japanese women with Korean men, because these Japanese women who were unmarried were falling in love with this Korean man who was so nice and sweet. Anyway, it was a huge hit in in Japan, huge hit in Korea as well. There's other Korean movies that were bigger hits in China, but this was the one that was a big hit in Japan about 10 years ago. And it helped to change the attitude of Japanese toward Koreans. There's been a sea change in Japan, such thing I thought I would never see. But these old prejudices about how bad Koreans are and how low class they are, these things are dying away. And now it's cool to be Korean. And Koreans are okay. And one interesting way to look at this, and I'm going to finish on this, is the competition between K-pop and J-pop. Can you tell the difference between the two of these? On the left is the J-pop, and the J-pop girls. On the right are the K-pop girls. The one on the right is at least 2 groups, maybe 3 groups. I don't know exactly, but I've got the girl groups here, but they're boy groups too. And K-pop and J-pop are really cool, and they symbolize a whole new era in Japanese-Korean relations. And for a long time, Korea has had its trouble with Japan, but now Korea is good. Korea is cool. So we'll end on that note, and we'll hope you have a good trip to Japan, and hope this story wasn't too negative. I didn't try to make it negative. I just told it the way it is. So have a good trip, and we'll see you when you get back. Let me know how it goes. And send me an email if you don't like what I said. I can take it. We'll see you.